Hello student, I am Professor Smita Jha and I am here to discuss circulating objects in the Victorian novel, as we are doing Victorian novels and literature, with the various aspects. So let us start to discuss what are the objects, what do I mean by saying circulating objects in the Victorian novel. Well, the literature that evolved during the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901 entered a new period after the Romantic Revival called as the Victorian Age literature. Victorian literature is a fusion of romantic and realist style of writing because it was preceded by romanticism that emphasized on imagination and was followed by modernism or realism. A new and highly original approach to the study of Victorian fiction is the analysis of the objects that figure in them, where the subject is not what the Victorians looked at, but rather how they looked at it. This involves an analysis of the effects of what Dan Gilmore calls exhibition culture, a viewpoint which resulted in extensive literary reference to what could be seen in the ever expanding art world. The exhibition culture takes several forms with respect to the literature it figures in. It can be the reference to the works of art which characters see or which they hang in their homes. It can be the use of language normally associated with the fine arts. It can be growth of art criticism, and it can also be the discussion of the merits and disadvantages of restoration. The Victorians were fascinated with objects and things. But recent scholarship has been proved to be equally fascinated with this Victorian obsession. Examining the rise of the commodity in Victorian culture and age, it can be seen that consumerism, semiotics, and the rise of culture studies have provided new approaches to Victorian culture and commodification. In his new book, titled A History of Britain in 100 Objects, historian Paul Crystal has uncovered the objects which define the nation's story. From ancient history right up to the modern day, a case can be made for each of these objects for the way it both shaped and influenced the history of Britain, especially during a time of industrial and economic revolutions. The Victorian era is famous for multiple factors. Among them are the collecting, hoarding, and displaying of things for the mass production and consumption of things, for the invention, distribution, and sale of things, for those who had things and those who did not. For many people, the Victorian period is intrinsically associated with paraphernalia or a collection of items associated with any activity or just lifestyle. This lecture explores the Victorian through their materiality and asks multiple questions like how and why objects were considered part of being Victorian, which objects defined them, represented them, and were uniquely theirs, and how reading the Victorians and their possessions through the literature of the time can deepen our understanding of Victorian culture. Miscellaneous and often auxiliary paraphernalia becomes the disjecta of everyday life, deemed neither valuable enough for museums nor symbolic enough for purely literary study. But this historical, cultural, and literary debris makes up the background of Victorian life. Valentine's cards, fish tanks, sugar plums, china ornaments, hair ribbons, dresses, and more. A study of the same paraphernalia can lead to understand how Victorian objects are used to construct the idea of the Victorian era today, especially in museum spaces. Literature can also be analyzed to study the relation of Victorian text to objects. This will in turn help the readers of the text in imbibing the relevance of the objects to the particular era in history. Many works in and about literature have already studied this relationship between the objects and the lives of people that revolve around them. The book entitled Things That Linger by Bruce Rogers talks about the residual objects of Victorian fiction. Remnants, trinkets, and scraps are lost in the background of the novel, grounding the text in a solid, shabby, and contingent material world. These damaged yet durable objects evoke broader cultural concerns about what to keep, what to discard, and the possibility of accomplishing either task. She emphasizes on the question of who could resist the hats, couches, buttons, newspaper, length of ribbon, packets of tea, bits of old lace, sugared plums, ink pots, keys, and pocket watches that clutter the pages of Dickens, overflow from Gaskell, and crowd in amongst the characters of Collins, Thackeray, Trollope, Eliot, and the Bronte sister. The Victorian had a preoccupation with the predilection for the careful and considered acquisition and utilization of objects. And this preoccupation has become a focus for critical trends in this area. In 2003, Lynn Pickett wrote that the Victorians were fascinated with objects and things, but recent scholarship has proved equally fascinated with this Victorian obsession. This obsession can be traced back to a turn in Victorianist criticism in 1980s, beginning with Asa Brick's Victorian Things, which was based on theories of commodity culture and writings of authors such as Jean Baudelaire, Rona Barthes, and Walter Benjamin. It showed an interdisciplinary interest in material culture, and particularly in consumer culture, including theories of consumption and commodification. More recently, critics have moved away from Marxist explorations of objects as commodities to explore the possibilities of the object in context other than those generated by discourse of exchange value, production, and consumption, adopting cultural materialist and new historicist approaches to the objects of Victorian culture and literature. This movement has become known as Thing Theory. Starting with Bill Brown's seminal work, A Sense of Things in 2003, critics have sought for ways of explaining the relationship between the subject and the object in terms other than those of the capitalist market system in order to take account of the complexities of the object as a signifier. Rather than looking at things in Heideggerian terms of their use and utility, or rather lack thereof, the idea of the disjecta should be explored more, where items are seen as an auxiliary to a greater part, neither valuable enough for museums nor symbolic enough for purely literary study. This will help in creating a better understanding of the relation between human lives and the objects that revolve around them. Before the critical method of Thing Theory surfaced in 19th century studies, the presence and circulation of objects often motivated discussions of Marxism, cultural materialism, and itemizing tendency associated with later Victorian realism. The thing theory helped the presence of such objects achieve a different level of making meaning. The work Bodies and Things in 19th century literature and culture is quick to differentiate its approach to the study of objects from familiar pathways, citing in their place the influential work of Bill Brown, who contributes an epilogue to the book, and Elaine Freedgood, whose book, The Ideas in Things, Fugitive Meaning in the Victorian novel, seems to be a touchstone for several of the essayists. Bodies and Things, following Michael Serres and Bruno Latour, also challenges a binary division between subjects and objects, animate selves and inanimate things. And undergirding the book, at least implicitly, is Heidegger's rejection of an unmediated presence of objects of any kind. Apprehension, in other words, is always a discriminating catalogue of personal and cultural perception. Isabel Armstrong, Bodily Things and Thingly Bodies, Circumventing the Subject-Object Binary, is an essay that opens with a dazzling reading of Jane Eyre's uneven resistance to objectification and expands into how the 19th century novel's crowded world of furniture, of chairs and tables, sofas and sideboards, stools and dressing tables proliferate meaning. In her concise intellectual history of the transformation from the fetish to thing theory, Armstrong attends to the way that commodification normalizes violence through the various modes of appropriation and colonialism that designate haves and haves not, rulers and subjects. Along the way, she locates some of the signal preoccupations of the Victorian novel in debates over the limits of materialism. Armstrong does not shy away from asking, what are the boundaries of our being? And are we entitled always to make objects our own, to think in terms of property of subject and object for our own privileged subjectivity? Authors like Kristen Luner and Catherine Spooner also touch upon the concept in their works. In Luner's essay on Mansfield Park, she argues that Fanny's management of personal possessions and domestic spaces shrewdly enables her class rise from orphan cousin to Edmund Burton's wife. Meanwhile, Spooner looks at ostensible linkages between personal accountment and identity in Trollope's The Turkish Bath, deftly allying Trollope with sensation tradition in showing how clothing and deportment can strategically miscue their observers. More conceptually ambitious is Murian O'Cinnady, Travelers, Bodies and Pregnant Things, Victorian Woman in Imperial Conflict Zone, reading two captivity narratives by British women in Afghanistan and India. O'Cinnady co-joins the status of domestic objects in captivity situations and the narrative occlusion of pregnancy in both texts. Babies are born without textual warning and in the midst of war zone. Harriet Titler, she writes, rhetorically replaces her otherwise textually absent pregnant body with an excess of absent things, and the textual existence of objects metonymically transfer bodily loss and destruction into the realm of material things. Writing about personal objects instead of fraught subjects, including pregnancy, childbirth, murder, and rape, suggests a number of deflective agendas: psychoanalytical, editorial, moralistic. But seeing those personal objects as encoded embodiments of real bodily trauma can appear a rather too expedient application of thing theory. Other essays by Samantha Matthews and Kate Hill challenge a subject object binary in reading the Victorian Woman's Album as an allegory for its owner, hidden emotional and imaginative life, and the museum exhibition of the bodily relic, locks of hair, mummified remains as materially betwixt and between the human thing device. Another essay on collecting named books in my hands, books in my heart, books in my brain, bibliomania, the male body and sensory erotic in late Victorian literature by Victoria Mills makes provocative claims about dandy aesthete book collector in fiction by Wilde, Huysmans, and Gissing, in a refreshingly phenomenological take on the conventional habit of reading queer desire as mental sublimation. While cultural materialism has explored these subjects in detail, John Ruskin's claim, for instance, that handwork materializes a worker's satisfaction, even joy, seems like a missed opportunity for an analysis of collusion between materiality and subjective embodiment in Victorian culture, especially since it was an era characterized by surplus production of goods. An examination of bodies and things in 19th century literature and culture does not suggest obvious limits to the frame, so that the contribution of thing theory to existing critical paradigms is not always clear, and there are moments in many of the essays mentioned that do not need thing theory to articulate what we already know. Well, some examples are here, like Fanny's exist from her dressing room coincides with her elevation in social status and the opportunity to wed a landed gentleman. The materiality of a woman's body becomes an essential politicized construct that facilitates overarching narratives of justified imperial violence. Museums sought to collect particular objects and subjects these objects to particular regimes of meaning. These grifts are not serious, but because things are everywhere in the 19th century text. And because the variety of things a study is so capacious, places, spaces, bodies, practices, objects, performances, there is a spatial obligation for the authors to pin down exactly how their observations constitute a new interpretation. Queen Victoria of England is credited for setting a number of trends in fashion, including the convention of bride wearing white to their weddings. After the death of King Albert in 1861, Queen Victoria revived the practice of wearing woven hair as a form of mourning, a tradition that can be traced back to 16th century. Designs range from single plaits to ornately woven pieces. It was also commonly believed that hair contained the essence of the deceased, so preserving a few strands was a sentimental way to hold on to departed loved ones. Over the 40 years she spent grieving, the queen was occasionally seen wearing a locket containing a lock of her husband's hair. Though the trend was short lived, lover's eye miniatures became popular among the European upper class around the turn of the 18th century. A scintillating branch of the history of miniatures, lovers' eyes were tiny portraits concealed in a locket or ring. With a lover's eye miniature, men and women could carry the likeness of a lover as a token of their affection without divulging their identity. References to lover's eye appear sporadically in Victorian era literature, such as newspaper diaries, even in Charles Dickens' novel Dombey and Son, 1846. So the Victorian period is famously characterized by its massiveness. With the vast extent of the British Empire, the enormous size of the 19th century city, and the massive scale of the three-volume novel. Yet, the Victorians were fascinated with miniature objects, which seemed in their small scale to belong to another world. Each miniature object prompted a unique imaginative fantasy of intimacy. The miniature painting, control the toy, wonder the microscope and the fairy, or knowledge the miniature book. In each case, the miniature posited the possibility of reality with a difference, posing the implicit question, what if? The miniature could be seen across a range of disciplines, from aesthetics and art history to science and technology, and from children's culture to book history. It shows how the miniature points beyond the limits of scientific knowledge and technical capabilities to the outer limits of the visual and speculative imagination. In novels, the miniature introduces elements of fantasy into the framework of realism, puncturing the fabric of the narrative with the internal reveries and longings of often silent women and children. Miniature objects thus function less realist details than a challenge changes to realism. In charting the effect of the miniature, both as a portal into the Victorian imagination and as a challenge to narrative realism, the techniques of material history prove very important. It aims not to describe the world of Victorians, but to show how the Victorians imagined other worlds. Throughout Victorian fiction, we find man-made objects scattered across the landscape. Objects survive over time, not as long as the stones, but longer than humans. Residual objects stay after the forest has been cleared and the city built up, after the snow has melted, after the lunch hour passed, the floor swept, the movables pawned, the fashions changed. These remnants survive the passage of time and the variations of the season. They resist people's efforts to clear, short, dispose of, and exchange them. Lingering things serve as reminders of the past, but also of the force of contingency that permits something to stay while others pass away. Remnants, trinkets, and scraps are lodged in the background of the Victorian novel, grounding the text in a solid, shabby, and contingent material world. They had a preoccupation with the fixedness of minor things, and the presence of damaged yet durable objects evoke broader cultural concern about what was to keep, what was to discard, and the possibility of accomplishing their task. The Victorian novel, with its litter of disintegrating yet durable things, complicates the question of what to keep, what to discard, and how to accomplish either task. The resilience of shabby objects evokes anxiety about how to handle the remains of the past and how to preserve an archive for the future. Accumulation breeds decay, but debris proves persistence. Neglected objects evade circulation and gather in the desk and the stockroom. A single word can capture the messy condition of these objects, as well as the containers that hold them, the hoard. The hoard, in all its meaning as a stockpile, a stoppage, accumulation, repository, and secret, thus becomes a structuring principle of Victorian culture and the novel form. Material objects and historical events and places incorporated into the 19th century British novel thus position the genre in a cultural moment, seemingly fixed in place. Residual objects tend to be detached from a specific actions or users. Victorian fiction rarely represents the moment when a minor character leaves an empty bottle in a cupboard or drops a scrap of paper in the gutter. When we notice these objects, they are already removed from any identifiable cause, now simply an inevitable feature of the landscape. The leftover bones and china on the dining table, the pins and the papers in the street, these things were already there, will always be there. The objects suspended in the background on the Victorian novel are taken as given grounding the text in a solid but shabby material world. The Victorian novel understands the intractability of things and locates it in even the most negligible of objects. When objects are primarily defined as signs of wealth, they also then becomes reducible to exchange value and replaceable with a sum of money. Marx tells us that everything is thrown into the furnace of circulation to come out again as the money crystal. The same transaction that moves an object from a window display into a home can be reversed. The economic system makes fungible all objects, even the most prized of possessions. Nothing is immune from this alchemy. The bones of the sense cannot withstand it. The potential pathos of such transaction is already plainly conveyed by Marx's choice of example object, the relic, and many Victorian works of art explore the personal or cultural damage wrought by that radical leveler, money. Victorian material objects, such as those on display in Rossetti's Shen Walk Home in Chelsea in this 1882 painting by Henry Treffy Dune, as well as historical events and places, fill our virtue cases and root the 19th century British novel in the material culture and history of the period. With its cluttered environment of objects, the Victorian novel conveys the contingency and opacity of the material world, even when that world is at odds with its characters. Victorian literature also represents the accidental archives of things, offering an assembly of scraps and objects that can offer random glimpses of past activity and perhaps most tellingly evidence of the force of contingency. The popularity of the Victorian Valentine arose in 1840s. Following the reform of the penny post, Victorian valentines were often handcrafted by men and women. There were different types of valentines, like the flaming valentines, which were a strong declaration of love. They became important objects of the era. James Beaton wrote a poem predicting the rise of posted valentines. The letters in St. Valentine so vastly will amount, postmen may judge them by the lot. They won't have time to count. They must bring round spades and measures to poor love-sick souls, deliver them by bushels, the same as they do coals. At the turn of the Victorian era, manufacturing would experience a boom like none before. A well-running economy and huge technological advantages combined to create a culture that not only produced an unprecedented amount of goods but also had the access fund to spend on things that were not necessity to live. The Victorian obsession with objects combined with other notions of proper culture such as sex and gender to create notable differences in the creation and urges of items dividing them along gender line. Perhaps none so much as the portable writing desk. In moment of critical fascination with the materiality of Victorian life, from glass world and novels behind glass to the ideas in things, it is worth remembering that it was 19th century educators themselves who trained their eyes on the object, the thing itself, the edifying, moralizing property already hidden in every piece of the material world. Included in this focus on the object were not only common domestic items such as glass, loaf sugar, gum arabic, leather, sponge, wool, wax, but also books. Then the books inhabits the world of familiar things in all their materiality. That is to say, the book, like gum arabic, is both well known and worth investigating as a material object. Interestingly, an object lesson also shows that pupils consider the book in all aspects of its material form, paying attention to its outside, inside, edges, corners, binding paper, backsides, top, bottom, title page, preface, introduction, contents, and leave, pages, margin, beginning, type, letters, number, stops, words, sentences, syllable, title, letter, stitching, and lines. The material turn in Victorian study is a pervasive interest in material culture and its meaning and significance that Len Pickett dates back to Asa Bridges' Victorian Things 1988. Nadine Bohem Skinker and Susanne Grass helpfully divide the current emphasis on material culture into three related scholarly streams. First, material culture studies, which analyzes material objects in relation to the social and symbolic practices involving them. Second, thing theory, which analyzes why and how we use objects to make meaning, to make or remake ourselves, to organize our anxieties and affections, to sublimate our fears and shape our fantasies, quoted in Bohem, Skinner, and Guess. And third, commodity is studied, which analyzes commodities in terms of how they are implicated in capitalist modes of production and consumption. The interest in the object as commodity, of course, looks back to the Victorian themselves and Karl Marx's definition of the commodity, which, as he writes, reflects the social characteristics of men's own labor as objective characteristics of the product of labor themselves, as the socio-natural properties of these things. Women and personal property in the Victorian novel reflects and develops the current interest in material culture and thing theory, but wine is less interested in the materiality, the thingness of things, than she is in the reciprocal relations between humans and the objects and the way in which things function within a property relationship. That this relationship is framed by law and custom, but it also encompasses the sentiments, bonds, and aspirations which may be invested in apparently trivial objects. Through a detailed examination of women's wills, Wynne demonstrates that Victorian women treated the will as a text through which the world can be reshaped. By maintaining tight control over the destiny of their favorite objects and bequeathing items which, strictly speaking, were not theirs to bequeath. Wynne's argument in the Victorian woman created her themselves feelings of ownership, claiming and performing ownership in ways which may not have been sanctioned by the law but in practice were rarely challenged. One of her key examples here is that of Dodson's sister in the Mill on the Floss, who retain an identity as Dodson, which overrides the claims of marriage and treat their possessions as though they are beyond the reach of the laws of coverture. Objects are the items for which subjects have known and clear sense of place, use, and role. Things, on the other hand, manifest themselves once they interact with our bodies, unexpectedly break down, malfunctioning, shed their encoded social values, or elude our understanding. When one encounters an object which breaks outside of its expected recognizable use, it causes a moment of judgment, which in turn causes a historical or narrative reconfiguration between the subject and the object, which Will Brown refers to as thingness. The ways what Victorians shopped for displayed and used object is important to be studied. Places like London's West End bazaars were primarily female-oriented spaces contextualizing the different shopping experience possible at the Soho Bazaar, the Pantheon and the Lowther Bazaar. A lively discussion of the purposes of each bazaar, its staff and famous visitors, coupled with list of objects for sale, enable critics to amply demonstrate what visiting such a space must have been like for Victorian shoppers. An exploration of the spaces devoted to objects offers an intriguing avenue of approach for scholars of material culture studies. The etagres, or a piece of furniture with open shelves used for displaying objects, can be often seen in Victorian literature, and it is an illuminating reminder of how the organization of a collection was highly prized as a signifier of personal taste. There was an important connection between the individual collector and the collection, one that may be missed by the outsiders when viewing such seemingly disparate objects. The rising mid-century interest in home aquariums and the decorations allowed collectors to participate in the latest fashion while simultaneously learning more about marine science. Plaster of Paris images or busts, typically of saints, authors, contemporary politicians, or other famous heroes, provided cheap, readily accessible decor for the homes of the working classes. The use of such objects highlight the shifting nature of the taste and the ways that suppliers regularly adapted to changes in cultural standard or current event. An exciting New contribution to our knowledge of Victorians and their material culture, their study of Victorian objects thus draws new attention to lesser study objects and how they were used by members of both the middle and working classes. It not only legitimizes a deeper study of disposable objects and their surviving representation in contemporary periodicals, but also opens a space for researchers to continue expanding this important work. With this, I conclude the discussion, that is the circulating object, and we have seen that how miniature had become the most passionate thing during the Victorian era. Also, the feminine items like the brochure, brooch, and also the hair clips, the hair design, the clothes, everything that made Victorian era a classic one. Let us meet in the next lecture with a new topic. Till then, thank you very much.